everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about the case of Kyllikki Saari. She was a young teenage girl who just suddenly disappeared one night on her way home, and it would be months before there were any developments or any news in the case, and sadly it wasn't the news that everyone was hoping for because Kyllikki's body was found. She had been murdered, and despite an extensive police investigation, this case actually remains unsolved to this day, and it's been nearly 7 decades since this happened. Now, this case actually takes place in Finland. It's one of the most infamous unsolved cases in Finnish history, actually. So I do just want to say I really apologise if I pronounce anything incorrectly in this video, if I pronounce any names wrong. I am going to try my best, but if I mispronounce something, I am really sorry, and please feel free to correct me in the comments. But just quickly, before we get into the case, I would like to say a massive thank you to one of my favourites, HelloFresh, for kindly sponsoring this section of the video. HelloFresh is a meal kit delivery service that offers a huge variety of different recipes every single week, which can be delivered straight to your door. I've been using HelloFresh for a while now because they just make cooking at home so much more fun and so much easier too. I'm sure a lot of you guys will be able to relate to this, but sometimes after I've had a busy and a long day of doing work, the last thing that I want to do at the end of that day is make dinner. The last thing that I want to do is work out what ingredients I need, work out how much of each ingredient I need, work out exactly how to cook the meal that I want to make, because it does take a lot of time, which is the exact reason why I love HelloFresh, because they can take away all of that stress. You literally just have to pick the meals that you want to try on their website and they will do the rest. They will send you the instructions and a box full of all of the pre-portioned ingredients that you need for that meal. So not only does it save you so much time, because it means that you don't have to make a trip to the supermarket to get the ingredients yourself because everything you need is in the box, but also it means that there is less food waste and you save money that would have otherwise been spent on perhaps excess food. In fact, HelloFresh actually cuts down on your food waste by at least 25% compared to grocery shopping. HelloFresh offers quick and easy meal kits, meals that you can make in literally like 20 minutes if you find that you don't have much spare time in the evenings. And as well as that, they also have vegetarian options, they have pescatarian options, and even carb smart and calorie smart options too. So if you would like to try HelloFresh, and I highly recommend that you do, then you can go to hellofresh.com and use the code MOLLY16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. Again, that's the code MOLLY16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. Once again, thank you so much to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video and supporting this channel. Thank you to you guys for supporting the sponsors on this channel. And now let's just get into the case. So for today's case, we are going all the way back to the year 1953 in a village called Isojoki, which is located in the South Ostrobothnia region in Finland. This is Kyllikki Saari. She was a 17-year-old girl who was born on the 6th of December 1935. Kyllikki's parents were called Aino and Wilhelmina Saari, and together they had 6 children, one of which was obviously Kyllikki. So this was a big family. I believe Kyllikki was the second youngest child of the family. She had 2 older brothers and 2 older sisters, and their names were Kalevi and Esko and Ali and Heli. And she had a little sister named Ritva, who was about 4 years younger than Kyllikki. She was 13. And the Saari family all lived together on a farm just a couple of miles north of the village of Isojoki. And the farm was the family's business. It was how they made their money, and Kyllikki's two older brothers worked with their father on the farm full time. As for Kyllikki, she had a job working in administration at the local parish in Isajoki, which she had been doing for about 8 months, and she really enjoyed this job. She got on well with the pastor and the other people that worked there at the parish, and she was really religious anyway, so it was the perfect job for her because she was very dedicated to her faith. Kyllikki was described as being a very happy and lively young girl. She was very into sports growing up. She had many friends. She wasn't always the type to get involved in activities that other young people did at the time. So for example, she never really went to any like local clubs or local dances. I think that just wasn't really her thing. And according to one source, she often suffered with really bad headaches, and this was following an accident that she was in when she was just 14 years old. I believe one day she was just cycling down a road when she was knocked off of her bike and she hit her head, and she actually had to stay in hospital for a little while afterwards because she had a concussion, and as I said, she experienced really bad headaches as a result. But apart from that accident, from what I can gather, Kyllikki had a good normal life. She was content in her work and she had a happy home life by all accounts. However, all of that would change in the spring of 1953 when 17-year-old Kyllikki Saari just suddenly disappeared one night when she was on her way home. The date was the 17th of May 1953. It was a Sunday, and so that day Kyllikki had been at church, and then at around 1 p.m. after the church service had ended, she went back home. When she got home, she had a little bit of a rest for a few hours because she was feeling quite tired, and then later on that day at around 6 p.m. she said goodbye to her mother. She got back on her bicycle and she went to a Christian youth prayer meeting that was happening that evening. The prayer meeting was being held in an old schoolhouse in an area called Merikavia, which was roughly just under 40 minutes away from where Kyllikki lived. So she cycled there, she got to the meeting okay, she stayed for a couple of hours, and then around 10 p.m. she began the journey home. And she was actually joined by one of her friends who also attended the prayer meeting. Her name was Meiju, and she lived about 3 miles away from Kyllikki, so they were going to travel most of the way together. So they were both cycling home alongside each other for a little while until eventually they got to the point where they had to part ways. Meiju had to go in one direction and Kyllikki another. And Kyllikki was very nervous about this. In fact, she had been worrying about it all day pretty much. She previously told her family that she was really looking forward to going to the prayer meeting that evening, but she was also just feeling very anxious about the journey home because she knew that she would have to do a portion of the journey on her own, and it was late. It was past 10 p.m. and it would have been dark by that point. There weren't any street lights, and the road that she had to cycle along alone wasn't like a main road, I don't think. It was like a country road. It was very quiet and remote, and it was surrounded by a forest. So when it got to the point where she did have to part ways with Meiju about 3 miles away from her home, she was scared, and Meiju could tell that she was scared. But regardless, the two girls separated at around 10:30 p.m. and Meiju later claimed that before she left, Kyllikki said, "I suppose it will go fine now, just as it has gone before. Bye then, Meiju." Following this, Kyllikki started cycling down the dark country road on her own. But she never actually made it home that evening, and Meiju was one of the last people to see 17-year-old Kyllikki Saari alive. Now, when Kyllikki didn't return home, her family weren't actually very worried at all. They initially just assumed that Kyllikki had decided to go and stay over at Meiju's house, which is something that she had done a couple of times. And even the next day, the Monday, when she hadn't returned, they still weren't worried again. They just thought that she was at Meiju's house. You've got to remember that this was almost 70 years ago now, so this was a completely different time. It was obviously a time before mobile phones and social media, so there was no like letting your parents know where you were by phoning them. Parents just had to trust that their children were fine and that they would return. However, 2 days after Kyllikki was last seen on the Tuesday, that was when alarm bells started to ring, because that day Kyllikki's parents were contacted by the parish where Kyllikki worked, and they were asking where Kyllikki was and if she was okay because she hadn't shown up for her shift. And it was when they heard that her parents did start to panic, because I don't believe Kyllikki had ever done that before. As I said earlier, she really enjoyed her job, so it was incredibly out of her character to just not turn up for work. And so shortly after this, her parents got in contact with the police and they reported their daughter as missing. The following day, so the 20th of May, the police began the search for Kyllikki Saari. They arranged a big search of the area to try and find her. In particular, they were really focusing the search on the spot where she and Meiju parted ways, because at some point along that route from that spot to her home, something happened to Kyllikki. So they really meticulously searched along that path, along that road, but nothing was found. There was no trace of Kyllikki. News of Kyllikki's disappearance actually spread very quickly throughout the local area and surrounding areas, and this was really helpful for many reasons. Firstly, it meant that upon hearing this news, a lot of people volunteered to help join the search for Kyllikki. I believe by the 21st of May, so just 2 days after she was reported missing, the police had 600 volunteers join the search party. And obviously the more people there were out looking, the better chance they had of finding Kyllikki. But also it was helpful because it actually resulted in a couple of people coming forward with information. One person that came forward was a local man named Ty Jaska. He worked as a labourer and he told the police that he had actually seen Kyllikki on the night that she went missing. He said that he saw her at around 10:40 p.m. that night, so this was after she separated from Meiju. He said that he was just cycling on his bike down the road when he passed Kyllikki on her bike. She passed him as she was cycling in the opposite direction. So he only saw her for a few moments, but when he saw her, she was still heading in the direction of her home. So that proved that she hadn't changed her mind and decided to go somewhere else. She clearly intended to go home that night, but something happened to her that meant that she didn't get there. And it turns out that this man, Ty Jaska, was the last person to see Kyllikki alive. But he wasn't the only person that came forward to the police with information. 2 other men actually came forward. It was a father and his son. And they said that early in the morning on the 18th of May, so the morning after Kyllikki disappeared, early that morning they were driving their carriage along the road close to the spot where Kyllikki was last seen when they noticed some tyre marks on the dirt road. There were car tyre marks and bicycle marks and also footprints. And around this there was also quite a lot of broken glass on the ground, so it almost looked like there had been a struggle, like 2 people had been in a fight. They didn't know for sure that this was linked to the disappearance of Kyllikki Saari, but as it was close to the place where she was last seen, they just thought that they should let the police know just in case it was connected. Maybe if Kyllikki was abducted and attacked, this was the spot where it happened, and that's why it looked like there had been a struggle. In addition to that, another witness came forward saying that shortly after Kyllikki went missing, they remembered seeing a car driving along the same road. It was cream in colour, a cream coloured car, and with it there was a bike. I believe it was in the back of the car. And again, they couldn't know for certain that this was linked to Kyllikki's disappearance, but obviously we know that she was riding a bike when she vanished, so maybe this was her bike. Maybe she was kidnapped and the perpetrator took her bike to hide it somewhere because they didn't want any trace of Kyllikki to be found. So those were the witnesses that came forward to the police. However, unfortunately, the information they provided didn't really progress the inquiry in any way. No one seemed to see what actually happened to Kyllikki, so the police had no idea whether she was even dead or alive. The search for her continued over the coming weeks, but sadly nothing was found. There was still no sign of Kyllikki Saari. However, just over 2 months after she disappeared, on the 22nd of July 1953, something was discovered. It wasn't Kyllikki, but it was her bicycle, the bicycle that she was using the night that she went missing. It was discovered by a woman and her granddaughter. They were out picking some berries in an area just over half a mile away from the country road where Kyllikki was last seen. And in this area where they were picking the berries, there was a bog, or like a marsh, and they noticed that there was something sticking out of this bog. It was the handlebars of a bicycle, and when the police went to the scene and they got this bicycle out of the bog, they realised that it was Kyllikki's. So this only made people even more concerned about Kyllikki. Before this discovery, no one had any idea what happened, and even though it was out of her character, I think people were hoping that she was alive and that she had just decided to run away and go off of her own accord. But now that her bike had been found, that really wasn't looking very likely, and it really wasn't looking good. Whoever had put the bike in this bog was clearly trying to hide it, so the police were pretty certain at this point that foul play had to have been involved in this case. When the police got the bike out of the bog, they actually noticed that someone had emptied the air out of the tyres, probably so that it would sink in the bog quickly. And interestingly, the police were able to determine that the bike hadn't been in the bog since Kyllikki disappeared. It hadn't been there the whole time. And it stated on one source that they knew this because shortly after Kyllikki was reported missing in May, the police actually searched that bog with a metal detector to see if it could detect anything, but it didn't. And also the bike was in pretty good condition when it was eventually found, apart from the air being let out the tyres. But the leather seat in particular was in good condition, indicating that it hadn't been submerged in the water for very long. So this also suggested to the police that the person who disposed of the bike in the bog was probably a local. They knew that it had already been searched by the police, so they knew that it was a good place to hide it because hopefully they wouldn't search it again, so hopefully it would never be found. But of course it was found by that woman and her granddaughter whilst they were out picking berries. So after finding the bicycle, the police continued to search the bog and the wetland and the area around it. However, nothing else was found, and unfortunately following this, the case started to go quiet again. They found no trace of Kyllikki apart from the bicycle until October of 1953. So this was 5 months after Kyllikki disappeared and 3 months after the bike was found, when the police decided to search the bog again. They basically wanted to search it again because it was winter now, it was October, and they were worried that they might get heavy snow and ice soon, which would obviously make it a lot more difficult and dangerous to search the bog. So they wanted to go over the area again before that happened, just to see if they could find anything new that linked to Kyllikki. And they did. On the 9th of October, they found a shoe in the bog, just one shoe, and it was soon confirmed to have been Kyllikki. She was wearing it on the night that she went missing. And stuffed inside of this shoe was Kyllikki's scarf, which again, she was wearing that night. And there was also a man's sock in there, which didn't belong to Kyllikki, I don't believe, or anyone in her family. This was someone else's sock, not hers. A couple of sources state that Kyllikki's other shoe was later discovered nearby, and again, just like the bike, these items were not found during the initial searches of the bog in May or during the search in July after the bicycle was found. So that suggested to the police that they had been dumped there recently. After the discovery of Kyllikki's shoes and her scarf, the police were pretty certain that Kyllikki was dead and that she had probably been murdered, because why else would someone feel the need to dispose of items of her clothing and hide them unless they were trying to cover up a crime? And so the search of the area continued, but now they knew that they were probably searching for a body. I think a lot of people had given up hope at this point that Kyllikki may still be alive, and everyone's worst fears were confirmed on the 11th of October 1953. That day there were roughly 300 people people out looking for Kyllikki around the bog and around the wetland, and just after 10 a.m, one of these searchers found something. In one part of the wetland, a couple of 100 meters away from the road, they noticed a tree branch sticking up out of the bog. So this searcher grabbed the tree branch, they pulled it out of the bog, and when they did, they realized that the end of it was really pointy and sharp. It looked like someone had sharpened it into a stake, and it had a very, very strong foul smell too. In fact, it was described as smelling like decomposition, the decomposition of a corpse. And so the police knew that they had to now focus their attention on this specific spot, this specific area where the tree branch was found. They started digging, and soon after this, they found the dead body of 17-year-old Kyllikki Saari, who they'd been looking for 5 months now. Kyllikki's body had been buried about half a meter down the bog, and it was determined that the tree branch that was sharpened into a kind of stake had actually pierced her body when it was thrust into the ground above her. And that's why it had a really strong smell of decomposition, because obviously it was inside of her whilst her body was decaying. But what was the reason for the tree branch? Why was it sticking out of the ground above the spot where Kyllikki was buried? Well, there were two kind of main theories surrounding this. The first was that maybe whoever buried Kyllikki's body wanted to kind of signpost where they had left it so that they would be able to find it again. Maybe for some sick reason they wanted to return to the burial site to remember what they did to her, and so they decided to mark the spot with the tree branch so that they could find it easy. Or maybe the tree branch was there because the perpetrator actually wanted people to find Kyllikki's body. Again, maybe it was a signpost but for other people. Perhaps it was to aid the police in their search for her, although that does seem quite odd, doesn't it? Why would they want people to find her body? If they wanted people to find her, why go through all the trouble of burying her in a bog? Why not just place her body on the side of a road or something, just out in the open? But anyway, after her body was discovered, Kyllikki was actually identified by her brother and father, who were also out searching for her that day. She was partially clothed when she was found. She was naked from the waist down, which suggested that this crime was probably sexually motivated, although it couldn't actually be determined whether or not she had been sexually assaulted by her killer. Experts were unable to confirm that. The coat that Kyllikki had been wearing on the night that she was last seen was actually wrapped around her head when she was found, and it also covered the upper part of her body. She was still wearing her bra, however, one of her breasts was not in her bra. It looked like either the perpetrator had taken it out purposefully, or if she was sexually assaulted, then maybe this happened while she was trying to fight her attacker off. Now, unfortunately, the pathologist was unable to work out Kyllikki's cause of death, exactly how she died, because her body was fairly decomposed by the time it was found. However, it is believed that she probably died from blunt force trauma to the head, because she had sustained very severe injuries to her face. She had a broken nose, her cheekbones were broken. It seemed as though she had been beaten around the head with some kind of heavy object, possibly a rock or a brick or something like that. So it seemed very likely that this was her cause of death. But again, this couldn't be 100% confirmed. Now, I couldn't really find any information online about how long the police believe Kyllikki's body had been there in the bog, because as I said, her body was pretty decomposed, indicating that she had been dead for a while. But also, her body wasn't found in the bog in the initial searches of the area, so maybe she had been murdered and then her killer kept her body for a while somewhere else before burying her in the bog. Or maybe she had been in the bog that whole time and the search teams just failed to find her. I also couldn't find any information online about how long the police believe she had been dead for. I'm guessing that they just couldn't determine that in her autopsy because of the state of decomposition. Obviously, as I mentioned, that in itself, the decomposition indicates that she had been dead for a while, but I don't believe it's known whether or not she was killed on the night that she disappeared or around then, or whether she was killed sometime after that. Maybe she was abducted and held captive for a few weeks or a few months before her death. Kyllikki Saari's funeral took place about 2 weeks after her body was discovered on the 25th of October 1953 at the Isajoki church, and there were so many people there. About 25,000 people attended, people from all over the country who showed up to pay their respects. As you would expect, this really hit everyone so hard. People were devastated, even people that didn't even know Kyllikki. Everyone was just so heartbroken that a 17-year-old girl's life had been taken in such a horrific way, and they couldn't understand why. What was the reason for this crime and who did it? Well, that is exactly what the police wanted to figure out. Who did this to Kyllikki? They wanted to catch the perpetrator, to obviously get justice for Kyllikki and her family, but also to prevent them from doing it again to another young girl. So after this case went from being a missing persons investigation to a murder investigation, the police decided to create a profile of the killer. They theorized what kind of person the killer was. They believed that the killer was a male, probably over the age of 30 years old. They thought that he probably didn't live with anyone. He lived on his own and he was a bit of a loner. It's likely that he didn't really interact much with anyone or have many friends. He was probably just someone that kept himself to himself. Perhaps people thought of him as a bit odd. He was someone that displayed very strange behaviour and had weird and unusual interests. The police thought that it was likely that he had probably committed crimes before this, possibly even murdered before. Maybe Kyllikki was not the first person that he killed. The way in which her murder was carried out suggests that this was someone that knew what they were doing. They attacked her late at night when she was on her own, when it was dark outside and there was no one around. And the way in which they hid her body too, burying it in the bog without getting caught, it seemed as though a lot of thought and planning had gone into this. The police weren't sure whether or not Kyllikki was killed by someone that she knew, whether she had been targeted and the killer chose her specifically, or whether they had just picked her at random. Maybe the killer didn't know Kyllikki, but he was out driving around that night looking for a victim and he just happened to spot Kyllikki walking back home, cycling back home, sorry, on her own, and so he saw this as his opportunity to strike. So they didn't know whether she knew her attacker or not, but they were pretty confident that the killer was a local. It was someone that lived in the area or a surrounding area. They had local knowledge because they knew where they could hide the body so that it wouldn't have been found. I mean, if you think about it, if that tree branch wasn't sticking out of the bog above Kyllikki, there's a high chance that her body would never have been recovered. So they really believed that the killer was someone that lived locally. It was a member of the community, and it's even been theorized that maybe the perpetrator was one of the many hundreds of people that joined in the search for Kyllikki in the months after her disappearance to try and avoid suspicion. The police worked so hard to try and solve this murder. They had countless lines of inquiry that they looked into. They interviewed and questioned thousands of people. They spoke to the residents of Isajoki, asking if they had any information about the case. They even chased down former residents of Isajoki, people who used to live in the area but that moved away shortly after Kyllikki went missing and was murdered. But despite their best efforts and despite Kyllikki's case being all in the press and all over the newspapers, the police could never catch the killer. They could never find any concrete, solid evidence linking anyone to the crime. But that doesn't mean that they didn't have any suspects in the case. There have actually been many suspects in Kyllikki's murder over the years, and I'm going to talk you through the main ones now. One of the very main suspects at the very beginning of this case was a man named Kyllikki, and he actually used to be the priest of the parish where Kyllikki worked. If you remember, she had an administration job at the Isajoki parish, so she knew Kyllikki well. He was essentially her boss. However, he moved to a different parish, the parish in Merikavia, which is about 40 minutes away from Isajoki, and he relocated there roughly 3 weeks before Kyllikki disappeared. And he was the prime suspect in this case back in the 1950s when this happened, and the reason he was the prime suspect was because he was actually a sexual predator. Kyllikki was known to have sexually assaulted many young teenage girls who were underage. They were children. And I believe many of the girls that he targeted were actually members of his parish. So he really betrayed their trust. He was their priest and he used them for his own twisted sexual perversions. In fact, just a couple of years after Kyllikki's murder, Kyllikki was arrested for having unlawful sex with a 15-year-old girl, and he was convicted for this and sent to prison, although I'm not sure how long his prison sentence actually was. But it makes complete sense why people suspected Kyllikki as being Kyllikki's murderer. We know that he knew Kyllikki quite well, and we know that she was his exact victim type. She was a young teenage girl. So because of this, the police started looking into Kyllikki. They wanted to see if they could find any evidence that linked him to the crime. He was questioned about Kyllikki and he completely protested his innocence. He said that he had absolutely nothing to do with this crime. Although according to one source I read, he did admit in his questioning that one time he asked Kyllikki if she would touch him down there and masturbate him. But he said that apart from that, he didn't do anything to her. He didn't kill her. Although there were actually rumours going around at the time that Kyllikki had groomed Kyllikki into being in a relationship with him, and that Kyllikki was pregnant at the time of her death, and that the father of her baby was Kyllikki. So maybe if Kyllikki really was pregnant with Kyllikki's child, he decided to kill her because he wouldn't have wanted people to have found that out. However, this rumour was literally just that. It was a rumour. It wasn't true. Kyllikki wasn't pregnant, and this was confirmed in her autopsy when her body was found. But it was also found that in the lead up to her death, I believe it was a couple of weeks before she went missing, Kyllikki had written and sent a letter to her former priest, Kyllikki. So the police were very keen to read this letter. They wanted to see what she had said in it, whether she had hinted at any kind of relationship that the two of them might have had. However, she didn't. Apparently this letter that she sent Kyllikki was literally just about the church and about religious matters and stuff like that. But regardless, Kyllikki was still a top suspect anyway, and so the police asked him what he was doing on the night that Kyllikki disappeared, and he said the following. He claimed that on the evening of the 17th of May 1953, he was at a church event in Merikavia, and then after that he just went home. So the police started looking into this story, and it was actually found that he was telling the truth. Witnesses were able to back up his alibi and confirm that he was at the church event, and then I believe his daughter and his maid were able to confirm that he was at home afterwards. Although, side note, it was found that he was actually sleeping with his maid at the time. I believe they were having an affair. But anyway, people were able to confirm his version of events. However, there was about a 20-minute gap of time where people didn't know where he was that night. 20 minutes of his night unaccounted for. So people started thinking that maybe in those 20 minutes he was out killing Kyllikki Saari, and then he just returned home afterwards acting as if nothing had ever happened. But that was actually impossible. As we know, he was in Merikavia, which is about 40 minutes away from Isajoki. So there's no way that he could have gotten to Isajoki, killed Kyllikki, and then made it back in 20 minutes. And also, he couldn't actually drive either. He didn't have a driver's license, so he had no way of getting there, no way to get there and back that quickly anyway. So because of this, and because of his concrete alibi, Kaiko was actually ruled out as being involved. The police did not believe that he was Kyllikki Saari's murderer. The second suspect in Kyllikki's murder was a local man named Vittori Lemusvita. I'm really sorry, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. I'm just going to call him Vittori. He was 38 years old and he worked as a kind of like handyman, odd jobs man, and also a ditch digger. However, Vittori had an alcohol addiction and he also had some issues with his mental health. Apparently he suffered from really bad PTSD after he served in the Second World War, and I imagine this is probably what led to him becoming an alcoholic. He was probably drinking so much to try and momentarily forget what he went through. The reason, however, that he was a suspect in this case was because he, like the priest Kaiko, also had a history of sexual assault. I believe he had been convicted of a number of sexual assault cases, and at the time of Kyllikki's disappearance, he actually lived about a mile away from the crime scene, from the area where Kyllikki went missing. So a lot of people speculated that maybe he was the killer. He killed Kyllikki Saari, although there was also a theory that perhaps he didn't do it on his own. At the time, it was rumoured that his brother-in-law helped Vittori bury Kyllikki's body in the bog. Vittori was questioned by the police about Kyllikki Saari, and he was actually questioned before her body was even found, so when this case was still just a missing persons case. And shockingly, during his questioning, apparently Vittori told the police that he knew Kyllikki was dead, and he said that he believed her body would never be found. And obviously after this, eventually she was found dead. But how did Vittori know that? Did he know that because he was the one who murdered her? It's stated on sources that he later took back what he said. He said that he didn't mean it, he didn't know why he said it, but regardless, of course, the police were still very suspicious of him. But despite this, they could never find any evidence linking him to the crime, and he actually had an alibi for the time that Kyllikki disappeared, and his alibi was provided by his mother. His mother said that her son was very, very, very drunk that night, and that he had basically passed out and was asleep in bed by 7 p.m. that evening. And she said that he was in the house all night, he was sleeping. Although, to be honest, I don't think that that is a very strong alibi, because his mother could have easily lied for him. If he was responsible for Kyllikki's murder and his mother knew that he was, she could have covered for him by giving him a false alibi. But despite that possibility, as I said, there was still no evidence connecting him to the case, so he could never be arrested or charged. Another suspect in the case was an ex-police officer. He was 35 years old, and unfortunately I couldn't actually find his name online, but I believe he used to work for the Isajoki police force, although he was fired from this job, apparently because of his, and I quote, bad way of life. Whatever that means. Sources state that he was known for being very dishonest, a bit of a liar, and he was unliked by a lot of the people in the community. And again, I don't know for what reason, but he was suspected as being Kyllikki's killer because if you recall from earlier on in the video, after Kyllikki went missing, the police received some information from a member of the public who said that shortly after Kyllikki vanished, he saw a cream-coloured car driving along the same road that Kyllikki was cycling along that night. And apparently another person came forward saying that they also saw a cream-coloured car driving along this road, and they saw the person driving it. They said it was this ex-police officer. They saw him driving along the road on the night that this case took place. But from what I can gather, this was the only possible connection that he had to this case. So it's a very weak connection in my opinion, but he was ruled out as a suspect anyway when the police looked into what he was doing that evening in May of 1953. Apparently it was found that he was out that night drinking with some friends in an area that was nowhere near Isajoki, so I'm guessing that witness was just mistaken. Another person of interest that the police looked into was another local man whose name, again, I unfortunately do not know. I couldn't find his name anywhere. I don't believe it's public knowledge, but he was just known as the Blackbeard man in this case because he had a really thick black beard. He was in his 50s and he was severely mentally ill to the point where I think he had to have a guardian with him a lot of the time, and he was known to harass women, a lot of the local women. I believe he would follow them and he would watch them, and one of the women that he had a bit of an obsession with was actually Kyllikki Saari. You see, he used to visit her at the parish where she worked very often, and apparently he used to call her his bride. I think he might have thought that they were engaged or something, which they obviously weren't. She was a 17-year-old girl and he was a man in his 50s. But because of this, I think a lot of people had their suspicions that maybe he tried to persuade Kyllikki to get into a relationship with him, but she rejected him, and so he just lost it and he decided to kill her. If he couldn't have her, then no one could. On the night that Kyllikki went missing, Blackbeard man was reportedly out on his own and he was throwing rocks and stones at people's windows. And then the next morning, so the morning after Kyllikki vanished, he actually attacked his guardian. He attacked them with a metal chain, and so the guardian literally got out a gun and they shot him to try and defend themselves. Blackbeard man did survive this gunshot. He was treated in the hospital and he survived. And following this, the police questioned him in relation to the case of Kyllikki Saari. But once again, they had nothing. There was no evidence linking him to the crime, and so he was pretty much ruled out. And the fifth and final suspect we are going to be talking about was actually one of the top suspects in this case, and a few of you might recognize this man or recognize his name. His name was Hans Assmann or Assmann, I don't know. And the reason I say you might recognize him is because he was actually one of the top suspects in another unsolved murder case that I have covered on this channel. He was a suspect in the case of the Lake Bottom murders, and I covered that case almost 3 years ago now, I think. I think it's like the second or third video on this channel. It's very old. But the Lake Bottom murders happened about 7 years after Kyllikki's murder in June of 1960. On the 4th of June, 4 teenagers named Mela, Anja, Seppo and Niels decided to go camping for the weekend along the shore of Lake Bottom, which is obviously a lake located in the city of Espoo in Finland. Espoo is about 3.5 hours away from Isajoki. However, in the early hours of the next morning, the 5th of June, the 4 teenagers were all attacked whilst they were sleeping in their tent. They were all beaten and bludgeoned and stabbed by the perpetrator repeatedly, and the only survivor of the vicious attack was one of the boys, Niels. The other 3 teenagers, Seppo, Anja and Mela, all died as a result of the injuries that they sustained. To this day, the case of the Lake Bottom murders remains officially unsolved, but as I said, Hans Assmann was one of the prime suspects in the investigation, just like he was in the investigation of the murder of Kyllikki Saari. So just for a bit of information about Hans, he was originally from Germany, however he relocated to Finland after the end of World War II, and he was actually a Nazi. He worked as a Nazi guard at Auschwitz, and he was also an alleged KGB spy. And he became a person of interest in this case, in Kyllikki's case, when his own wife actually got in contact with the authorities and said that she believed he may have been Kyllikki's murderer. She claimed that on the night that Kyllikki disappeared, her husband was out in his cream-coloured car. and he was just out driving around near Isajoki with his chauffeur. He had his own driver, and she said that when he returned home, she noticed that her husband's shoes were soaked. They were really, really wet, and he only had one sock on. He was suddenly missing a sock. Now, if you remember, just before Kyllikki's body was found, one of her shoes was discovered in the bog, and inside the shoe was a man's sock that didn't belong to her or anyone in her family. So it was theorized that this was the killer's sock. And Hans' wife said that her husband returned home that night without one of his socks. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but maybe not. His wife also said that just a few days after this, Hans went out with a shovel. So maybe if he was Kyllikki's murderer, he used this shovel to bury her body. One thing that has also been mentioned online a lot is the fact that Hans was left-handed, and the police involved in Kyllikki's case did believe that her killer was left-handed too. I don't know exactly how they can tell this, but apparently from how Kyllikki's body was buried in the bog, how her grave had been dug, they could tell that the perpetrator was probably left-handed. So that's just another reason why people suspected Hans, because he was also left-handed. Although that's not really evidence, is it? I don't think it's really even circumstantial evidence, because thousands of people are left-handed, but it's just interesting, I guess. But anyway, after receiving this information from his wife, the police did start looking into Hans Assmann as possibly being the killer. However, they pretty much ruled him out because they looked through his records and they apparently discovered that he only moved to Finland in late 1953. So he moved there after Kyllikki disappeared. He wasn't in Finland when she went missing. However, years and years and years later, in 1997, so 44 years after Kyllikki's death, when Hans Assmann was on his deathbed, he began telling his life story to a man named Matti Polero, who was an ex-police officer and the editor of a crime magazine. And during this conversation, Hans actually told Matti about how one day he was out in his car with his driver when his driver accidentally hit a young girl with his car and she died. And so they decided to cover this up by trying to make it look like a murder. They staged a murder. And he said that the reason he had to cover it up was because he was a KGB spy and no one was supposed to know that he was in that area at the time in Finland. He reportedly said to Matti, quote, "One thing I can tell you straight away, because it is the oldest and that kind of accident which had to be covered up, otherwise our trip would have been discovered. Even though my friend was a good driver, the accident could not be avoided. You know what I mean." Now, I don't believe that Hans ever actually said the name of the girl that was hit with his car. He didn't say that it was Kyllikki Saari, but a lot of people believe that it was. They think she is who he was talking about. Hans died the following year in 1998, and despite his admission on his deathbed, once again, just like with the other suspects, the police could never find any solid evidence that he was the one who murdered Kyllikki. And so to this day, Kyllikki's murder remains unsolved. As you can tell, there have been a number of suspects, but never enough evidence against any of them to prove that they were the killer. Kyllikki Saari's murder is still one of the most infamous cases in Finnish history, and yet she still hasn't received justice for her death almost 70 years later, which is just so sad that her family never received any answers as to who did this to her and why Kyllikki. I'm actually unsure as to whether the police are still looking into Kyllikki's murder to this day or whether it is a cold case officially. But if they are, and I can find some contact details for anyone with potential information, then I will leave that link down below. It's a long shot because this case is quite old now, but you never know, so I will leave those linked down below if I can find some. But that is it for this case. I look forward to hearing your guys' thoughts on this one. Do you think that Kyllikki's killer was one of the suspects that we've discussed in this video, or do you think none of them were responsible? Do you think it was someone else that has just never been identified? Please do let me know your opinions in the comments, and also let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Again, you can let me know in the comments or through my case request form, which is always linked in the description box of my videos. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly. Bye guys.